Hi, I'm Joe Feeks, editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Peter Davies. He is a professor at the University of Minnesota. It's great to see you, Peter.
Great to be here, Joe.
I want to talk with you about antibiotic resistance. I know you spent a lot of your career focused on that subject, but let's start by talking about antibiotic usage, because that's really where it all starts. I know the Food and Drug Administration came out with a big report in December 2018, showing really some dramatic declines, at least in antibiotic volume. And I think it was like the medically important antibiotics used in the pork industry were down something like 35%. It was comparable in cattle. I think poultry saw an even bigger decline of around 47%. So those numbers sent a lot of people dancing in the streets, and maybe for good reason. But is volume a good report card for antibiotic usage?
People generally are in agreement that use is what drives selection for resistance, and all the prescribing professions have a responsibility to look at how they're using drugs and using them more effectively and more economically from a point of view of use less for the maximum medical benefit. The volume of drugs usually on a weight of antibiotic ingredient is the easiest thing to measure. The difficulty is that different drugs have different potencies. So as a overall measure, you can't really assess the biological impact on a weight basis, because it really depends which drugs are in the composition. So you could technically reduce the volume of drugs by using more potent and more medically important drugs. I think that's not the circumstance with the data that we're seeing in the US, because this transition was followed on from the implementation of FDA's regulatory changes and moving a lot of products away from over-the-counter availability and bringing them under veterinary oversight. I don't think those two things are an accident. I think from a veterinary profession point of view, we have more responsibility, particularly for all products in feed and water now, and so we do have more veterinary oversight. So I would well, I'd say it's not an exact measure. I think the fact we've seen a reduction in response to the legislation, and we have more veterinary oversight for more of the animal industries now, I think that those two things do add up to probably an increase in more effective use, or more importantly, elimination of unnecessary use, which is really the thing that is in no one's interests.
And you've mentioned the word responsibility a couple of times. Is reduced use the same as responsible use, or vice versa?
Yeah, that is, and a lot of the European countries now are very focused on reduction in antibiotic use, using a range of metrics as an end in itself. And my own view is that reduction in use is really an intervention, because what we're trying to do is reduce any possible impacts on resistance in human health that's associated with use in animals, or in our case in the food supply chain. That argument of the extent of that impact has been going for a long time, and we're no closer to any real understanding of it. I sort of take the view that it's intuitively it's not zero, therefore we should be looking at improving our practices. So in all the professions, including ours, we need to understand what we're doing, focus on more effective use, and getting to it that way. I still think we've got a lot to learn in terms of optimizing our antibiotic use. And I think on the animal side, reduction in itself is not an endpoint. What we need to be doing is optimizing use, and which on one side means we have the human health resistant concerns, but on the other side we have issues related to maintaining animal health, to animal well-being, and also the safety and security of the food supply. So there are even in the best possible circumstances, animals will get sick, just as they do in the wealthiest societies. People still get sick and still need appropriate treatment. That will never stop in the animal industries, and I think it's a responsibility on the veterinary side is to really make that judgment in terms of using antibiotics as much as necessary, as little as possible, and keeping that balance between the outcomes on the animal health and production side and the uncertain but possibly at least real impacts on human health risk.
And you use the expression optimizing use. Is that what that looks like, trying to balance responsible use with the welfare of the animal?
That is, in my mind, what I mean by optimization. And I think that the drugs are used for a purpose, and that purpose is to manage health in populations of animals we're raising for food. There will certainly there's things that the industry's been doing for many years in improving the conditions of rearing, improving the environment, improving animal flow, using vaccines. All those preventative measures are already a very central part of how the animal industries are managed. And it's a question of doing those things, but then using antibiotics strategically in order to deal with the periods of greatest risk in the animal's life cycles, which we understand, and managing those real animal health risks as equitably as we can from a point of view of animal health. Yeah, I've written things before about how food safety is a very important thing and antibiotic resistance is a very important thing. But the intersection of the two of them is actually relatively small because of the burden. If we look at the burdens of foodborne disease in the United States and the CDC data, it's substantial, but most of those cases don't involve antibiotic treatment at all. Most people don't seek treatment with foodborne disease, so there's a large part of foodborne disease where antibiotic resistance is not of concern. On the other hand, in antimicrobial resistance, if we look at the major pathogens of concern to the medical doctors, most of them aren't foodborne pathogens. There are other organisms that, the staph, the strep pneumonias, those sorts of organisms that have limited or in some cases no animal reservoir. So, but there is an intersection, and it's predominantly in the areas of the major foodborne bacteria, Salmonella, Campylobacter, and so they're the pathogens of most concern in terms of resistance. And again, with those pathogens, the industry's made progress largely by improving hygiene levels in the slaughter plants. So in the US, we've had a substantial reduction in Salmonella carcass rates monitored by the FSIS, and we've seen reduction in the incidence of several of the bacterial foodborne diseases. Salmonella is the one that's continued to be problematic, but in others we've seen Campylobacter and Listeria Yersinia, we've seen substantial reductions tied to improved hygiene. So that's another way that we can enhance the food safety. We need to do a lot more basic science in understanding the ecology of some of those foodborne pathogens in the gut of the animals, because I think what we've learned is doing simplistic management things haven't yielded answers because the biology is just too complex. First of all, need to make sure that our profession is aware of its legal obligations in the way antibiotics are used within the country. The industry's done I think a wonderful job over the last 30 years of educating producers and veterinarians about responsible use, so that we used to have problems with antibiotic residues in the animal industries, which have now more or less completely disappeared. The resistance argument is a little bit more complex to measure, but I think we're moving forward. I personally wouldn't advocate for the level of oversight in terms of monitoring and the cost that puts on the industry. I think we can, through education programs, we can achieve the goals of more responsible use without having necessarily national level regulatory requirements for antibiotic measurement. Again, because with the metric side, we still don't really understand how they link to resistance. Yeah, I think what success looks like is that we continue to have an abundant, affordable supply of safe proteins for the consumer market. I would argue that we largely are achieving those goals now. That the number of food safety incidents that have been linked to pork is relatively low. So I think as an industry we're doing a fairly good job. I think there is room for improvement in terms of optimizing our antibiotic use, and I think we'll continue to move in that direction. But I think on the pig side, you know, the goal that we'd be producing pigs with antibiotics is a fairly unrealistic one for the biology of the pig. Pigs are live born at the back of a sow. They have to be weaned. They have to live 6 months. The biological risks are very different. So I think we will see some expansion of niche raised without antibiotic production. But I think in terms of the ability to continue to feed the world with its animal protein market, it's hard for me to see that antibiotic free production will be a substantial component of the pig, the pork market.